The train shrieked as it slowed into the dusty station, its iron wheels screaming against the rails like a warning. Isabella Martinez clutched the small leather suitcase resting on her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Outside the train window stretched the endless plains of the American frontier, golden grass bending beneath the wind, scattered wooden buildings, and a town so small it looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. This was Willow Creek, and somewhere in that town waited the man who had promised to marry her, or at least, that was what the letter had said. Isabella pressed the folded paper inside her coat pocket, feeling its edges like a fragile promise. Mr. Thomas Whitaker, branch owner, widow, seeking a good-hearted woman to help raise his daughter. Those words had carried Isabella across half a continent. Back home in Texas, opportunities for a woman like her had been scarce. Being of Mexican heritage meant doors closed before she could even knock. Work was hard to find, respect even harder. When the letter arrived from the Western Matrimonial Agency, it had felt like fate opening a door, a new town, a new husband, a new life. Most of all, a family. The train hissed as steam burst into the cold morning air. Willow Creek. The conductor shouted. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Isabella stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her modest blue dress. It was the nicest thing she owned. Her mother had sewn it before she left. Wear something beautiful, her mother had whispered. First impressions matter. Isabella stepped off the train. Dust swirled beneath her boots as she scanned the platform. Several men stood, waiting, ranchers with sunburned faces and white hats. For a brief, hopeful moment, her heart fluttered. One of them must be him. She took a hesitant step forward, but as their eyes met hers, something changed. Their expressions hardened. One man leaned toward another and muttered something Isabella couldn't hear. The second man shook his head. Another simply turned away. The hope in Isabella's chest began to shrink. She waited. Minutes passed. Passengers left the station, one by one, until only a few remained. Still, no one approached her. The conductor glanced at her with mild curiosity. You waiting for someone, miss? Isabella forced a polite smile. Yes, my husband. The conductor raised an eyebrow. Husband? She nodded and carefully unfolded the letter. Thomas Whitaker. The conductor's expression shifted. Oh, just that one word. Double quotes. O.it was the kind of O that carried 1,000 unspoken meanings. Well, he said awkwardly. Whitaker's ranch is about 2 miles west of town. Isabella felt confusion stir in her chest. He didn't come. The conductor shrugged. Guess not. The train whistle blew again, signaling departure. Within moments the station emptied, leaving Isabella standing alone in the drifting dust. The wind tugged gently at her dress. She looked down at the letter again. Maybe something happened. Maybe he had been delayed. Maybe he didn't know the train arrived today. Hope was fragile, but it was still alive. So Isabella lifted her suitcase and began walking toward town. Willow Creek looked exactly like the kind of place where secrets traveled faster than horses. Wooden storefronts lined the main street. A blacksmith hammered glowing metal. Children ran between wagons. But as Isabella passed, conversation slowly faded. People stared, not openly, but enough for her to notice, enough for her to understand. 2 women standing outside the general store whispered behind their hands. A man sitting outside the saloon spat tobacco and muttered, "Mail order bride." Another voice added quietly, "Mexican one." Isabella kept walking. Her cheeks burned, but she refused to lower her head. She had endured worse in Texas. Prejudice was not new, but today it felt heavier, because today she had come hoping to belong somewhere. Why the time Isabella reached the edge of town. The sun had begun climbing higher. The Whitaker Ranch Road stretched westward across rolling land 2 miles. The conductor had said. Her suitcase felt heavier with every step. Dust coated the hem of her dress. But she continued walking because turning back meant admitting something she wasn't ready to face yet. What if he changed his mind? The thought slipped into her mind like a shadow. She pushed it away. No. He had written kindly. His letters spoke of loneliness, of raising a young daughter alone since his wife passed. A man like that wouldn't abandon someone, would he? An hour later, Isabella finally saw it, the Whitaker Ranch, a modest but sturdy homestead surrounded by grazing land. A red barn stood nearby, smoke curled from the chimney. Her heart leapt. Someone is home. She smoothed her hair quickly and walked toward the porch. Her pulse raced as she knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps sounded inside. The door opened. A tall man stood there, broad shoulders, weathered, face dark stubble along his jaw. His grey eyes studied her. Cautiously, "Can I help you?" Isabella's breath caught. "Mr. Whitaker?" "Yes." She smiled with hopeful relief. "I'm Isabella Martinez, from Texas." The moment the words left her mouth, everything changed. His expression hardened instantly. Confusion turned to something colder. "You're the bride." Isabella nodded nervously. "Yes." From the agency, silence stretched between them, behind him. Somewhere inside the house, a small child laughed faintly, but Thomas Whitaker didn't smile. Instead, he exhaled slowly and rubbed his forehead. "This is a mistake." The word struck Isabella like a slap. I don't understand." Thomas stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "You should go back." Her heart dropped. "But your letters." "I didn't know." He interrupted. His gaze flicked over her face briefly. "You didn't know what?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. Then he said it. "I didn't know you were Mexican." The word hung heavy in the air. Isabella felt something inside her chest crack. "I wrote my full name," she whispered. "Martinez." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I assumed." He stopped himself, but Isabella understood the rest. He assumed she was someone else, someone more acceptable, someone white. The wind swept across the prairie between them. Isabella felt suddenly very small standing there with her suitcase. "I traveled 3 days," she said softly. "I spent my last savings." Thomas looked away. "I'll give you money for the train back." The offer sounded like charity, like dismissal, like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Isabella's throat tightened. "I didn't come here for money." Another silence. From inside the house came the faint creak of a door. Neither of them noticed. Thomas finally said quietly, "I'm sorry, miss, but this won't work." Those 4 words shattered the last fragile piece of hope Isabella had carried across the plains. She bent slowly and picked up her suitcase. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. "I understand." She turned to leave, but just as she stepped off the porch, a small voice whispered behind her. Soft, curious, lonely. "Wait." Isabella turned, standing in the doorway. Behind Thomas was a little girl no more than 6 years old. She had golden hair tied in messy braids and wide blue eyes filled with shy wonder. The girl looked at Isabella for a long moment. Then she walked past her father and stepped closer. Her tiny fingers reached out and gently touched the edge of Isabella's dress, and in a quiet voice barely louder than the wind, she asked, "Can you be my mommy?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. "Can you be my mommy?" Isabella Martinez froze on the wooden porch steps. For a moment, she thought she had imagined the words, but when she turned around, the little girl was still standing there, looking up at her with hopeful blue eyes that seemed far too serious for a child her age. Thomas Whitaker stiffened beside the doorway. "Emily," he said firmly, "go back inside." The girl didn't move. Her small hand tightened slightly around the fabric of Isabella's dress. "But Papa," she whispered. "She looks nice." Thomas sighed heavily, running a rough hand through his hair. "Emily." "Now, still." The child refused. Instead, she looked back at Isabella. "Are you leaving?" The innocence in her voice pierced Isabella's heart. She hesitated before answering. "I think I have to." Emily's lower lip trembled. "But I asked for a mummy." Thomas stepped forward quickly. "That's enough," he said quietly, lifting the girl into his arms. Emily buried her face against his shoulder but kept peeking over it toward Isabella. Her eyes were wide with silent pleading. Thomas avoided Isabella's gaze. "I'm sorry about that," he muttered. Isabella swallowed the ache rising in her chest. "It's not her fault." "No," he admitted. "It's mine." He paused before adding quietly, "I shouldn't have written to the agency." Isabella nodded slowly. Her grip tightened on the suitcase handle. "Well, thank you for your honesty." She stepped down from the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last. The prairie wind brushed past her as if urging her forward. Behind her, the ranch house door creaked shut. The road back to town felt twice as long. Isabella walked silently beneath the wide open sky. Her mind replayed the moment over and over again. The look on Thomas Whitaker's face when he realized who she was, the rejection in his voice, and most of all, Emily's question, "Can you be my mommy?" Isabella blinked quickly, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. She had promised herself long ago never to cry in front of people who judged her. But out here, alone on the empty prairie, the loneliness pressed against her like a weight. For the first time since leaving Texas, doubt crept into her heart. Maybe coming here was a mistake. Be why. The time Isabella reached Willow Creek again, the sun had begun dipping toward the horizon. The town looked different now, colder, more distant. The same two women from the general store were still standing outside. They watched Isabella approach. One of them raised an eyebrow. "Well," the woman said loudly enough to be heard. "That didn't take long." The other chuckled. "Yes." Whitaker changed his mind. Isabella kept walking. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, but humiliation burned inside her chest. She stopped outside the small boarding house near the end of the street. A wooden sign creaked. Above the door, "Willow Creek Boarding and Rooms Taking a Steadying Breath." Isabella stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Behind the front desk stood a sturdy woman in her 50s with silver hair tied into a tight bun. She looked up as Isabella entered. Her sharp eyes studied the dusty suitcase and tired expression. "You looking for a room?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am," Isabella replied softly. "For how long?" Isabella hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." The woman nodded slowly. "Name?" "Isabella Martinez." The woman paused briefly, as if processing the name. Then she slid a small ledger across the desk. "Room upstairs. Second door on the left." Relief flickered inside Isabella. "Thank you." But just as she reached for the key, the woman added, "Name's Margaret Hale." Her tone softened slightly. "You look like you've had a long day." Isabella managed a tired smile. "You could say that." Margaret leaned against the counter. "Whitaker Ranch." Isabella's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Everyone knows when the mail order brides arrive," Margaret said matter-of-factly, "and everyone knows how Whitaker feels about outsiders." A knot formed in Isabella's stomach. Outsiders? Margaret shrugged. Town's not exactly welcoming to change. She pushed the key toward Isabella. But a room's a room. And money spends the same no matter where it comes from. It wasn't kindness exactly. But it wasn't rejection either, right now. That was enough. Isabella climbed the narrow wooden stairs. Her small room contained little more than a bed, a wash basin, and a window overlooking the quiet street. She placed her suitcase on the bed and sat beside it. For a long time she simply stared at the fading light outside. The reality of her situation settled in slowly. She had no husband, no family, no job, and barely enough money left for a few nights stay. Yet strangely, the thing she kept thinking about wasn't Thomas Whitaker. It was Emily. The little girl's hopeful voice echoed in her memory. Can you be my mommy? Isabella pressed her fingers gently against her temples. Stop, she whispered to herself. It wasn't her place to think about the child. She was leaving Willow Creek soon. She had to. There was nothing here for her. Meanwhile, 2 miles west of town, Thomas Whitaker sat alone at the kitchen table. The lantern flickered softly beside him, across the room. Emily colored quietly with a small set of crayons. Thomas hadn't spoken much since Isabella left, but Emily had been watching him carefully. Finally, she asked, "Why did you send her away?" Thomas rubbed his jaw. "It's complicated." Emily tilted her head. "She was nice." Thomas sighed. "You barely met her." "But I liked her." Emily insisted. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Emily, she smiled at me," the girl continued, "and she looked sad." Thomas looked toward the window where the prairie stretched endlessly into the darkening horizon. Something twisted in his chest. Because the truth was, Isabella hadn't looked angry when he rejected her. She had looked hurt, deeply hurt, and for some reason that feeling lingered in his mind like an unwanted ghost. Emily climbed off her chair and walked over to him. "Papa?" "Yes? Are we always going to be alone?" The question struck him harder than he expected. Thomas swallowed. "I'm here with you. But you are not a mommy," Emily said quietly. Her words carried no accusation, only simple truth. Thomas didn't know how to respond. After a moment, he lifted her into his lap. "We'll be all right," he said softly. Emily leaned her head against his chest. "But," she whispered something so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "I wish she stayed." Later that night, Thomas stood outside on the porch. The stars blanketed the sky. The same road Isabella had walked stretched toward Willow Creek. He stared down it for a long time. The memory of her standing there with its suitcase replayed again and again in his mind. The disappointment in her eyes, the dignity with which she walked away. Thomas clenched his jaw. He had told himself he made the practical choice, but something about it didn't feel right. Not anymore. Inside the house, Emily's soft voice drifted through the open window. She was talking in her sleep. "Don't go." Thomas frowned. Curious, he stepped quietly into her room. Emily tossed beneath her blanket. Tears slid down her cheeks as she murmured again, "Mobby." Thomas felt something heavy settle in his chest, because the truth he tried to ignore was simple. His daughter had not called anyone mommy since her mother died, until today, and the woman who made her say it was now alone in a boarding house in town because he sent her away. Back in Willow Creek, Isabella lay awake staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. Outside, the wind rattled the window. Her mind replayed the day endlessly, the rejection, the whispers, the loneliness. But somehow, through it all, one memory remained stronger than the rest. Emily's tiny hand clutching her dress, and the hopeful whisper that followed. "Can you be my mommy?" Isabella closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her cheek, because for the first time in years, she realized she wanted something she had long believed impossible. A place where she belonged. A place where someone needed her, and somewhere deep in her heart, she feared she had already walked away from it. The next morning in Willow Creek arrived quietly. Soft golden sunlight spilled across the wooden buildings, warming the dusty streets after the cold prairie night. Inside a small room at the boarding house, Isabella Martinez sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the last few coins in her hand. They clinked softly as she counted them. Again and again. The number didn't change. $3.40. That was all she had left out. It wasn't enough for a train ticket. Not even close. Isabella closed her palms slowly, hiding the coins as if doing so might make the problem disappear. But problems on the frontier rarely disappeared. They only grew bigger. She took a deep breath and stood. If she wanted to survive in Willow Creek even temporarily, she needed work, and quickly, downstairs. The boarding house smelled of frying eggs and fresh bread. Margaret Hale stood behind the small kitchen counter, pouring coffee into chipped mugs for a few early customers. When Isabella appeared, Margaret glanced up. "You look like someone who didn't sleep." Isabella offered a tired smile. "I suppose it shows." Margaret placed a plate of toast on the counter. "Sit." "Oh, I couldn't. You can." Margaret interrupted firmly. "And you will." Isabella hesitated before sitting. At the small table, the warm food in front of her made her realize just how hungry she was. "Thank you," she said softly. Margaret poured her a cup of coffee. "So," she said casually, leaning against the counter, "what's your plan?" Isabella lowered her eyes. "I need work." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Town's small. Jobs are scarce. I'll take anything," Isabella said quickly. Margaret studied her face for a moment. "You know sewing?" "Yes." "Cooking?" "Yes." "Cleaning?" Isabella gave a small laugh. "All my life." Margaret crossed her arms. "Then maybe there's hope for you yet." Relief flickered in Isabella's chest. "Really?" Margaret shrugged. "General store sometimes needs help. Laundry house too." She paused before adding carefully, "Just be prepared. Some folks here aren't exactly welcoming." Isabella already knew that, but hearing it said aloud still stuck. "I understand." Margaret slid a folded piece of bread toward her. "Eat first, then go prove them wrong." Isabella spent the rest of the morning walking through town asking for work. The blacksmith barely looked up from his hammer. "No need." The laundry house owner shook her head immediately. "We're full." At the general store, the shopkeeper listened politely, but when Isabella finished speaking, he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Sorry, miss. Folks around here, well, they might not take kindly to it." "To what?" Isabella asked quietly. He hesitated. "You working here?" The meaning was clear. Her last name, her heritage, her difference. Isabella thanked him politely anyway and stepped back outside. Each rejection chipped away at her hope, but she refused to give up. Not yet. Meanwhile, 2 miles west of town, trouble was brewing at the Whitaker ranch. Emily Whitaker sat quietly at the breakfast table while her father drank coffee, but her mind wasn't on breakfast. It was on Isabella, the nice lady with sad eyes. Finally she spoke. "Papa?" "Yes." "Where does she live?" Thomas lowered his cup slowly. "Who?" "The lady." Thomas knew exactly who she meant. "I told you, Emily. She left." "But where did she go?" "To town." Emily brightened slightly. "Then we can visit." "No," Thomas said firmly. The little girl frowned. "Why not?" Thomas struggled to find the right words, because the truth felt ugly when spoken out loud. Sometimes, he said carefully, things just don't work out. Emily stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, because she's Mexican. Thomas froze. The question hit him like a hammer. Where did you hear that? Emily shrugged. The men in town said it yesterday. Thomas felt a cold wave of shame wash through him. Children noticed more than adults realized. He leaned forward. Emily, listen to me. But the little girl had already slid off her chair. I am going outside. Before he could stop her, she ran out the door. Thomas sighed. He assumed she would play near the barn like usual. He was wrong. Back in Willow Creek, Isabella walked slowly down the main street. Her feet were sore. Her hope was fading. She stopped near the town well and rested her suitcase beside the wooden railing. Maybe she could try another town. Maybe she could find a wagon heading somewhere else, anywhere else. But before she could think further, a small voice called out behind her, Miss Isabella. Her heart skipped. She turned quickly. Running down the dusty road was a tiny figure in a blue dress, golden braids bouncing. Emily Whittaker. Isabella's eyes widened. Emily. The girl skidded to a stop in front of her. Breathing hard, I found you. Isabella crouched down, startled. What are you doing here? I walked, Emily said proudly. You walked from the ranch? Emily nodded enthusiastically. It was nearly 2 miles. Alone, A wave of concern rushed through Isabella. Oh my goodness. She gently brushed dust from the girl's sleeve. Your father must be worried sick. Emily shook her head. I didn't tell him. Isabella sighed softly. You can't run away like that. I didn't run away. Emily insisted. I came to get you. Isabella's heart squeezed painfully. Emily. The girl grabbed her hand. Please come back. I can't. Why not? Isabella struggled to explain something a child shouldn't have to. Understand, your father doesn't want me there. Emily frowned. But I do. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes again. Children had a way of saying the simplest truths. But before she could respond, a rough voice interrupted them. Well, Isabella looked up. 3 men stood nearby, local ranch hands she had seen around town. One of them smirked. Looks like Whittaker's little girl found herself a new nanny. The other laughed. Or maybe she's trying to steal the ranch. Isabella stood slowly, placing herself slightly in front of Emily. That's enough, she said calmly. The men stepped closer. You should leave town, one of them muttered, before people start thinking you belong here. Emily clutched Isabella's dress nervously. Isabella kept her voice steady. I am not causing trouble. Your kind always does, the man replied coldly. Suddenly, a deep voice thundered from behind them. That's enough. Everyone turned. Thomas Whittaker rode toward them on horseback, his expression dark as a storm. He dismounted quickly and stepped forward. The ranch hands backed away slightly. Didn't mean anything by it, one muttered. Thomas's voice was ice. Then leave. They didn't argue. Within seconds the men disappeared down the street. Thomas turned toward Isabella and Emily. Relief and anger mixed in his face. Emily, he said sharply, you could have gotten hurt. The little girl lowered her head. I just wanted to see Isabella. Thomas ran a hand over his face. Then he looked at Isabella. For the first time since their meeting, his expression held something different. Guilt. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for yesterday. Isabella met his eyes calmly. You already apologized. That doesn't mean I was right. Emily looked between them. Hopefully. Does that mean she can come back? Thomas hesitated. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he said slowly, "I need to think." Emily sighed dramatically. Adults were so complicated. But Isabella knew something had changed, because for the first time since she arrived in Willow Creek, Thomas Whitaker was no longer looking at her with rejection. He was looking at her with doubt, and maybe, just maybe, with regret. The tension in Willow Creek lingered long after the ranch hands walked away. Dust drifted slowly across the street, as if the prairie itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Thomas Whitaker stood facing Isabella, uncertainty written across his weathered face. Emily held Isabella's hand tightly, as if afraid someone might pull them apart again for a moment. No one spoke, finally. Thomas cleared his throat. "Emily," he said quietly, "we need to go home." The little girl frowned. But now his tone wasn't harsh, but it left little room for argument. Emily sighed dramatically but nodded before letting go. She leaned closer to Isabella and whispered, "Don't leave town." Her hopeful eyes searched Isabella's face. "Please." Isabella forced a gentle smile. "I'll try." That seemed to satisfy the girl, at least a little. Thomas lifted Emily onto his horse before turning back toward Isabella. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you." Isabella studied him calmly. "You were honest. That doesn't make it right." Silence stretched again between them. Thomas seemed like a man searching for words he wasn't used to saying. Finally, he nodded once. "I'll see you around." Then he mounted his horse and rode away, Emily waving enthusiastically until they disappeared down the road. Isabella stood there long. After the dust settled, something had shifted, but she wasn't sure what it meant. Yet, that evening the prairie sky darkened. Earlier than usual, heavy grey clouds rolled across the horizon like a slow-moving wall. Inside the boarding house, Margaret Hill glanced out the window with concern. "That storm's coming fast," she muttered. Isabella looked up from the table where she had been mending a torn shirt for Margaret. "The wind changed," Margaret continued. "That usually means trouble outside." The first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. Storms on the frontier could be brutal, especially the sudden prairie storms that seemed to rise out of nowhere. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "Best stay inside tonight." Isabella nodded, but her thoughts drifted toward the Whitaker ranch, out there on the open land. Storms hit harder, and Emily. The thought made Isabella uneasy. 2 miles west, Thomas Whitaker was finishing evening chores when the wind suddenly picked up. The barn door slammed loudly. Emily stood on the porch watching the dark clouds gather. "Papa," she called nervously. "I don't like this storm." Thomas glanced toward the sky. His instincts told him this one might be worse than usual. "Stay inside," he told her. "I'll secure the horses." Emily nodded reluctantly and stepped back into the house, but the wind howled louder by the minute. Rain began falling in sharp, slanted sheets. Inside the house, Emily sat near the window, hugging her doll. Every flash of lightning made her jump. She tried to be brave, but storms always reminded her of the night her mother died. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. She ran toward the barn to find her father. "Papa." But outside the wind was already fierce. Rain soaked her dress within seconds. The barn door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, but Thomas wasn't inside. He had gone to check the far fence. Emily suddenly realized she was alone. Thunder cracked loudly overhead. The little girl panicked. She ran back toward the house, but the storm had grown so fierce she couldn't see clearly through the rain. The path disappeared beneath swirling dust and water. "Papa," she cried, her voice vanished in the roaring wind. Back in Willow Creek, Isabella stood near the boarding house window, watching the storm intensify. Something about it felt wrong, dangerous. Margaret shook her head. No one should be out in that. Isabella's heart began racing. For reasons she couldn't explain, she kept thinking about Emily. Suddenly she stood. I need to check something. Margaret stared at her. You're not going out in that storm. But Isabella was already grabbing her coat. It'll only take a moment. Where are you going? Isabella paused at the door to the Whitaker ranch. Margaret blinked in disbelief. In this weather? But Isabella had already stepped outside into the storm. The prairie wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain lashed her face as she struggled along the muddy road. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the landscape in brief bursts of silver light. She had only walked halfway when she heard it, a faint cry carried by the wind. Help! Isabella stopped. Her heart pounded. Emily, she called. Another flash of lightning revealed a small figure stumbling through the rain. Emily! The little girl turned. Relief flooded her face. Isabella. Emily ran toward her, but slipped in the mud. Isabella rushed forward and caught her just before she fell. You're freezing, Isabella said, wrapping her coat around the trembling child. I couldn't find Papa. Emily sobbed. It's all right. Isabella whispered softly. I've got you. She lifted the girl into her arms and turned toward the ranch house. Every step through the storm was a battle against the wind, but Isabella didn't stop. Meanwhile, Thomas rode back toward the house after securing the fence. The storm had worsened dramatically. As he approached the barn, a terrible realization struck him. Emily wasn't inside the house. Her doll lay abandoned on the floor. Emily! Panic surged through him. He rushed back outside, shouting her name into the storm, but the wind swallowed his voice. Fear clawed at his chest. Where could she be? Then through the rain, he saw a faint silhouette approaching from the road, a woman struggling against the storm, holding a small child. Thomas spurred his horse forward. Emily! The girl lifted her head weakly. Papa! Thomas dismounted and rushed to them. Relief flooded his entire body. But when he looked at Isabella, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Strength, courage, kindness, all the things he had been too blind to see. You saved her, he said quietly. Isabella shook her head. I just found her. Emily clung to Isabella's neck. I knew you'd come. Thomas's throat tightened. He helped them inside the house quickly. Emily was wrapped in blankets near the fire. Gradually, her trembling stopped, but she refused to let go of Isabella's hand. Thomas watched the scene silently. The woman he had rejected, the child who already loved her, and the family that might have been lost forever tonight. Finally, he spoke. Isabella. She looked up. His voice was steady but full of emotion. I was wrong. The words came slowly but sincerely. I judged you before I knew you. Isabella didn't respond. Immediately, Thomas stepped closer. You crossed a storm to save my daughter. His eyes softened. That tells me everything. I should have known from the beginning. Emily looked between them excitedly. Does that mean she can stay? Thomas smiled gently at his daughter before looking back at Isabella. If she wants to. For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. Then she glanced down at Emily. The little girl squeezed her hand tightly. Please. Tears filled Isabella's eyes. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Belonging. She looked back at Thomas, and finally, she nodded. Yes. Emily squealed with joy and threw her arms around Isabella. Mummy. Thomas chuckled softly. and for the first time in a very long time, the Whitaker house felt like a home again. Months later, the town of Willow Creek gathered outside the small white church. The prairie grass swayed gently in the warm wind. Inside, Isabella Martinez stood beside Thomas Whitaker. Emily sat proudly in the front row, holding a basket of flowers. The same townspeople who once whispered now watched quietly, because courage had a way of changing hearts, and kindness had a way of building families where none existed before. As the ceremony ended, Emily ran forward and hugged Isabella tightly. "See?" she whispered happily. "I told you you'd be my mommy." Isabella smiled through happy tears. Sometimes the family we search for across the world is simply the one brave enough to choose us back.